Welcome back, my animal studies class. I hope all things considered, you had a nice week. I've gotten a number of presentations from everyone. Not everybody yet, but I've had a number of them, and so far most of them have been really, really quite good. I've enjoyed them. So kudos to you all. I'm looking forward to viewing the rest of them. So this week we're going to talk about ecofeminism. That's our topic for the week. And so let's just jump straight into it without further ado. Let's get to a definition. So I think everybody loosely understands or knows what feminism is. So ecofeminism, I think you might want to think of it, I would say ecofeminists think of themselves as maybe having a more capacious understanding of their concerns. So ecofeminists are concerned, of course, with the subordination of women in politics, in culture, and in history. Politics and culture and history that are deemed to be overwhelmingly patriarchal in almost all societies. But they're not only concerned with subordination of women in politics, culture, and history. They're also interested in the subordination of nature as a whole, and of course within that, other animals, non-human animals. So be that wild animals in the wild, or animals that have been domesticated. And oftentimes we're going to see there's a theme in this class where the domestication of animals and the domestication of women kind of run in tandem and are critiqued in tandem. And there are some disturbing, we're not going to get into this, but there is a disturbing history of the domestication of women, which is closer, we're going way, way back, like to the Neolithic period. But maybe not that far back. I'm sure we can find instances of this in more recent human history, of the domestication of women being close to how we now consider domesticated animals to be kept or treated, certainly to be used as property. Okay, so this is the broad scope of ecofeminists. There's a conjunction, a symmetry. Well, not a complete symmetry, but a link between the subordination of nature, animals, and women. So ecofeminists will argue that oppression and discrimination of women, which we would call sexism, and of animals, which we would call speciesism, are linked in various ways. And so this is some of the things that the theorists we talk about today, the artists, and some of the examples, all of them are in some ways going to tap into this structure and to these concerns. So in as a whole, ecofeminism as a school of thought is against both male supremacy and human supremacy. And ecofeminists will argue that feminists really only consider male supremacy, and that they're still anthropocentric, and they found an issue with that. I'll leave that up to you. That'll be an interesting thing to think about, whether or not only talking about male supremacy and leaving aside other forms of supremacy over nature, supremacy over animals, is okay to do. So at the outset, I should say and make clear that ecofeminism is still quite a small subset of feminism. And in fact, there are some feminists that are pretty hostile to ecofeminism. And this happens in a lot of different domains that have to do with advocacy for minorities or minority positions. So there's often it's deemed a threat to advocate for animals for various reasons, and some of them may be quite compelling. We'll talk about this more next week when we have our post-colonial class, because we address this issue head on. But it's also part of this discussion. So Linda Burke, who's written really beautifully, she's a biologist, but she does a history of biology and the history of science, and she's written beautiful texts that she definitely considers herself an ecofeminist, showing how we should be concerned not only with female humans but also non-human animals and nature as a whole. And so she talks about this friction, this antagonism within feminism itself, which is a very real thing. And she says that for many political activists, to think about animals is to demean human politics. Surely people are more important, they might claim. But then she goes on and she says, perhaps this is so in some contexts, but that doesn't mean that how we treat non-humans is unimportant. Abuse is abuse, whoever is on the receiving end. So her point, I think, is to underscore that, yes, there may be moments where we have to prioritize humans. There may be moments when we have to prioritize advocacy for women, for female humans, over nature, over non-human animals, and so on and so forth. There may be instances, so like spreading out resources, being attentive to the way in which women in history have actually been animalized and treated as inferior through the figure of the animal. There are ways in which, as thinkers, we have to be attentive to these things. But she'll also, I think she's arguing that you can't use that as a way out to then not think of other forms of abuse. And just because you might say that one form of abuse is more important than another, it doesn't mean that that other one is not unimportant and it doesn't deserve some attention, right? So that's where she's coming from. And that's where a lot of ecofeminists are coming from. And that'll be this is broadly speaking our concern for today. I gave you a reading by Val Plumwood. It's just a really nice little introduction into an ecofeminist position of how an ecofeminist would understand the natural world and her position within it. So I hope you get to read it. It's very short. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on it in your responses. This week, I'm really hoping that everyone talks a little bit about this reading and also the Carol Adams reading, which Carol Adams is a really important thinker for ecofeminism. And we'll talk about her at the end of this lecture. But this is a wonderful short text called Pray to a Crocodile. And I'm not going to talk about it too much because you're going to read it. I don't want to spoil anything. But basically, it's about her being attacked by a crocodile. And this almost, let's say, epiphany she has about what it meant to be attacked by a crocodile, to be vulnerable, to be in a place that actually she's not sovereign, she's not master, right? She comes with she comes out of this experience with a number of really key insights that certainly applies to ecofeminism. Val Plumwood is now a canonical ecofeminist thinker. And for me, the most amazing thing, and the one I think it's hardest to think through or to understand or to sort of sympathize with or empathize with, is this idea of revenge. And immediately after the attack, as she's being sent to the hospital, and I love the fact that the hospital was called Darwin Hospital, immediately she says, do not go and kill that crocodile, for reasons that are really quite interesting. And there was a young girl recently, I think it was a YouTube video that was quite, I don't know if it went viral technically, but it was quite popular. It was a news clip of a young girl. I think it was, I'll try to find it and I'll post it on the website. She was attacked by a shark off the coast of, I think, the Carolinas, something like this. This really bright young girl, right? And unfortunately, she lost a leg. She lost part of her hands. And you'd think it'd be this really catastrophic thing, but the way she talks about it, it's incredible. It's very compatible with what Plumwood went through. She became immediately an advocate for sharks, doesn't want people to go kill sharks, and has become an activist because sharks are they're part of bycatch. They are killed for their fins, and for various other reasons, right? So it's almost counterintuitive. You'd think you'd be really resentful and you'd want revenge, but in fact, for some people, I have no idea how I would respond. I'd like to think I would be this noble and this ecofeminist. Some people respond with a total opposite impulse, right? So I'll upload that video for you because it's quite fascinating. But please read the Plumwood. It's very short, and it's a lovely text. She's a really important thinker. So let's dig just a little deeper into the ideas that are important for ecofeminism. And here I just present you a constellation of terms that I'm going to touch on. I'm going to try not to stay too theoretical at the beginning of the class, because then we'll end up mushrooming. It'll start getting too big. So I hope I don't go too quickly. But I'm going to run through some of this constellation of terms that are important for understanding ecofeminism. So the first thing we want to think of is that ecofeminists are almost always against binaries and dualisms. So you find this in certain feminisms, in queer theory, the idea that we should actually be pulling away from using steadfast binaries like male-female, and in fact, we should be working with a much more rich, capacious points of reference that are non-binary. You have just kind of an explosion of different categories that we would use to understand the complexity of what it means to be a human, what it means to be living in this world. And ecofeminists then extend this to say that it's crazy to think of, it's as crazy to think of we only have men and women, it's as crazy to think of male-female as this strict binary with its fixed terms, as it is to think human-animal. And this binary we've been breaking down all semester long. So the borderland between human and animal, it's become complicated and fuzzy, and it's collapsed in all sorts of different ways. So ecofeminists will also attack the binary between human and animal. So there are so many implications to this. I could spend hours talking about this. But one of the biggest ones is to think that the human is part of culture, part of politics, whereas the animal is a purely biological entity, right? There are so many problems with that binary, to think in those steadfast terms, right? Because there are all sorts of ways in which us humans, we're biological. It's inevitable. I'm here. I have a body. I'm talking to you. It's conditioned in all sorts of ways as a biological creature. And animals themselves are in some ways cultural. They're part of politics, and they're part of this larger world that we live in. They're not simply these disinterested biological beings somewhere out in nature. And the current pandemic that we're experiencing, COVID-19, I think it's very clear how animals are part of a larger ecological, political, social fabric that we're in, right? I mean, we can trace this virus back to the domestication and the eating of animals, right? Back to these wet markets. But like the Guardian essay I gave for you, I uploaded for you to read, please, I see this when I've seen this on the internet. I've seen this and heard some people, I think people like Bill Maher, get quasi-discriminatory, quasi-racist about this, as if it's only these wet markets in China or in these non-Western places in the world that are a problem, that breed these diseases. That's so far from the truth. Swine flu, bird flu, all sorts of diseases. Really, almost there are some scholars and researchers who say, but basically every major pandemic, every major disease has been born out of the domestication of animals, and that includes the stuff that Western people do, that come out of factory farms in the United States, feedlots in Latin America and in Europe, and so on and so forth, right? So we don't want to say that this is a problem that comes from foreign lands, right? This is a problem inherent to the domestication and the domination of animals of any kind, be they bats, pangolins, or pigs, or cows or chickens, right? I mean, this is where the bird flu comes from. This is where swine flu comes from, and it poses a real problem. So the connection between humans, viruses, and animals, that completely breaks apart the dualism between humans on one side, their political and their cultural and their social, and then animals are just out there somewhere in this natural state. No. We're completely networked and connected in all sorts of ways that are good and that are also bad. They can lead to devastation and destruction. So these themes we'll talk more about, actually the whole semester, when we talk about the aesthetics of extinction, when we talk about post-colonialism, one of the ways in which the West was able to decimate Latin America 5 centuries ago was actually through cowpox and smallpox and diseases that they brought with through their domesticated animals. And then all the way up to the ecology, the Anthropocene that we're going to talk about at the very end. So these ideas have a lot of legs for us, so I hope this makes sense for you. So ecofeminists will break apart binaries and dualisms, and I just gave you one example right there. They're not going to be so into rights. So they're going to critique rights theory. So remember Singer or Reagan, people like this, that make arguments and that write whole books about why animals should have rights. Ecofeminists are not necessarily against the idea of rights, but they're attuned to the fact that rights always privilege a certain type of being, usually like certain capacities, like the capacity to live autonomously, the capacity to reason, the capacity to very clearly feel pain, right? Ecofeminists will say that these things whittle down the field a little too much, that there in fact may be other forms of being that we don't understand, that in fact aren't so clearly a part of reason as we understand it, or suffering as we understand it, and this is where we get to being attuned to difference. And ecofeminists will say, the way we've conceptualized rights, it's still way too anthropocentric. We still privilege certain capacities that primates have, or higher level mammals have, and maybe some birds. But this is actually too limiting. And ecofeminists will go further and say that actually this attention, this prioritizing of reason and the ability to think, and even the ability to understand other animals as individuals, that's actually part of a human history. That's actually part of a liberal history. So there's a bias at the center of rights. And they go even further and say that the way in which rights theories are written, it's usually written in such a way that's very detached, very reasoned, very rational. They're trying to convince you of something. And they say that's all fine and good, but there are other ways in which we're caring beings. There are ways in which we're compelled not by arguments, not by reason, but sometimes we're compelled by other things. Our limbic systems, the way we empathize, the way we're called to care for vulnerability, right? So this is then where we get to care theory. So ecofeminists will maybe have less of an emphasis on the ability to reason and argue about rights, and more, they're going to be more attentive about the way in which dependency and vulnerability and the urge to care, to be cared for and to care for others is probably more compelling than a reasoned argument, right? And on top of this, the whole history of feminism, the whole history of the old binary between men and women is that men have reason, they're rational, they're the ones who have arguments, who think, and then women are emotional. Women are the one who they're sentimental, they're more irrational creatures. These are the kind of biases that have been floating around within history, within culture and politics for forever. It's only recently where this type of binary is starting to break down. So ecofeminists will say, and they'll try to uncover how thinking about rights is coded with this whole baggage of men as the ones who have reason, who can argue for rights, right? We've already talked about linked oppressions. So I think that should be clear. The plight of nature, animals, and women are in many ways linked, and in very tangible ways. We'll see this for sure with Carol Adams at the end here. And then androcentric mastery. So the very idea of mastery, of having mastery over nature, of having mastery over animals, of having any sort of mastery as a historical narrative, as a power, is androcentric. Andro means male, and then centric, of course, is like the center, right? What really matters is male mastery in history, and this is often associated with the mastering of nature and the domination, the dominion over animals, right? So this is something that ecofeminists will critique, that we in fact have to pull back. We got to get away from this idea of mastering nature and animals, that we're not these godly sovereigns here on this planet. We're interwoven within this much larger fabric of planetary life, and this is one of the insights that I think Val Plumwood gives in her short, compelling text, Parade of a Crocodile. Okay, so that's the theoretical armature. That's the theoretical underpinnings of of ecofeminism. And I want to give you one more quote by Donna Haraway, who's a really wonderful thinker, a really wonderful writer. She has a very famous, it's now become somewhat notorious, well, maybe not notorious, I might be going a bit far, but almost a cry to arms for this multi-species, eco-feminist, non-mastery kind of position. Make kin, not babies. So what does she mean by this? Well, I pulled this quote from her essay, Making Kin. And this is a central idea to ecofeminism. So she'll say that no species, not even one as arrogant as us, humans, pretending to be good individuals, none of us actually acts alone. We're assemblages. An assemblage is a French word for something that's interwoven. It's totally connected. It's made up of multiple parts that you destroy it if you pry them apart. We're assemblages of organic species and of abiotic actors, and we're the ones that make history. And this is how evolution works. So her idea is that the way in which the human has been formed, the way we understand ourselves as human, it's crazy to think that we're some autonomous, separate thing. I mean, 90% of our DNA is non-human. We have more non-human entities in our guts, in our microbiome, than all the cells in our bodies, right? And that's just inside our bodies. There are all sorts of ways in which, as a species, we're dependent on the planet, we're dependent on other species, we're dependent on the natural world. So this idea of not acting alone, this idea of never being pure individuals, we're always connected in this larger fabric of what we understand life to be, is key to ecofeminism. And I think Donna Haraway says it really beautifully here. So she says, if there's to be a multi-species eco-justice, it's going to have to embrace, yes, of course, diverse human peoples, because we're also dealing with not only human supremacy, but let's admit it, the recent 500 years of history, if not further, we're talking about a Western Anglo American white supremacy. Right? That latches on, that's latched on, and is concomitant with humanist supremacy. So on top of embracing diverse human peoples, we should also have the imagination, the theories, and the action to understand the way in which we have a genealogy and a kin to other species, right? And then she says, I think that the stretch and recomposition of kin are allowed by the fact that all earthlings are kin in the deepest sense, and it's past time to practice better care of kinds as assemblages. Kin is an assembling sort of world. All critters share a common flesh, laterally, semiotically, and genealogically. So it would take me much more time to unpack this this last sentence. So let's just I don't want to go overboard with the theoretical introduction for the class, but essentially what she's saying is that normally we think of kin as, I guess, kin. If I say the word kin or kinship, you might think, oh, mother, father, sister or son or something like that, right? This very human, family-centered sort of understanding of kin, but her understanding of kin is much more broad. Kin would simply be all the critters, all the creatures out there, when we're one of them, and we all share a common flesh, and we're all assembled together. So that's why she says, make kin, not babies, which is it's kind of a fun rallying cry, which is definitely eco-feminist and multi-species. Okay, so now let's get to our examples, where all these ideas that I've been introducing you to are gonna unfold. So the first one is actually not from visual art. It comes from film and from literature. I can't recommend this film enough or this novel enough. It's really just, they're both really mind-blowing. And this is one of those rare moments where the film is almost as good as the book. Usually books are always better than the films that people make out of the books. But in this case, it's really quite remarkable how well they did making this film off the book. So it comes from a 1968 novel. It's definitely an eco-feminist novel by Marlon Haushofer, an Austrian artist, called Die Wand, which is German for the wall. And then it was made into a movie in 2012. So it's there's a very simple premise. It's in some ways creepy. It's not an easy watch, and I'm realizing now that the film is really about social isolation. So it would be very heavy and charged to watch now. So watch this movie someday. But if you don't feel up to it right now, I wouldn't, because it's a lot about social isolation, and it is a very emotional film to watch. It's actually, especially at the end, it's quite difficult. So it's a brilliant film. It's a brilliant book, but and I highly recommend everyone reading the book and watching the film. But maybe now is not exactly the time, unless you really feel strong. So let me just show you the trailer. So the premise is you have a woman who goes off onto vacation in this country home, and she's very much a city person. And she goes to this country home with friends. The friends one day leave to go to the grocery store. They never come back. She doesn't understand what's happening, so she goes out and she tries to see. She notices there's no one anywhere, and she gets to the end of this space that she's in, where the house is located, and she comes up against an invisible wall. And that's the premise of the film. And so you might ask yourself, what in the world does this have to do with what we're talking about? Well, over the course of this time, she has to sort of basically resign herself that this is her new world. And this city person that never thought about nature, never thought about other animals, all of a sudden she's thrown into the situation where she has to live and collaborate and form, in Haraway's terms, she has to form assemblages, des assemblages with other animals in order to survive. Okay, so it's a very, very beautiful film. Let me just show you the trailer, and then we'll move on to our art examples for this week.
Lux, komm. Today, I will begin my report. So many things have happened to me that I must write if I don't want to lose my mind. There were 4 of us. Lynx was closest to me, my only friend. I had no choice but to finally face up to reality. I had no thoughts, no memories. I knew this feeling could be dangerous for a solitary person. I can see that this is not yet the end. But something new is coming.
So it's very, very intense, but it thematizes all sorts of really wonderful eco-feminist themes that we're going to touch upon today. And the dog Lynx is the director's dog, and I'm telling you, if the Oscars really need to introduce a new category, best non-human actor, because this dog would win it hands down. It's amazing. So let's look at some examples. Of artists that would fall under this rubric. You know, a lot of these artists maybe wouldn't call themselves eco-feminist per se, but their work in many ways is eco-feminist in spirit. So the first I show you is by Annette Messager, a French artist, beginning in the 1960s, taking off in the 1970s, still an important contemporary artist today. One of her earliest work is called Little Borders. And I've written about this work in my dissertation. It's a really beautiful work. One day she found a dead sparrow out on the street of Paris, and you've probably seen dead birds. I've seen every once in a while you see a dead bird, and you wonder actually where they go and what happens to them. I'm sure they just get swept up and thrown in the trash. And so her impulse actually was to take it home and to care for it. And she started doing this almost pathologically. There's almost this pathological mothering sort of nurturing thing of almost a Hitchcockian sort of taking in these dead birds and treating them as children. So she did all sorts of things with them, one of which would be to knit little sweaters, so they each get their own little sweater. And here they are all in display. So it's very important. It's not like Damien Hirst, where she went out and she started killing sparrows to use as objects for art, right? There's a way in which, I don't know how you would describe it, like a form of restitution. It is strange that we have these little creatures that, I don't know about you, but when I walk by in the city, when I stop and listen, I hear them chirping. I mean, they're pretty amazing, and you see them looking for food, you see them flying around, and then they inevitably die, right? And then they're just there. They just become brute, like basically material trash to get thrown out. So there's a way in which this is kind of a lovely way of caring for the body after the bird has perished. Being attentive to the body, a type of restitution. So this gesture of care, a type of care that you would normally only reserve for human children, right? Making clothes. Not that it would be bizarre and disturbing to keep dead human children under vitrines with little homemade sweaters. So there's definitely a difference here between the display of a dead bird and the display of a dead human, right? I mean, there's a clear tabooed difference inherent in this work. But nonetheless, there's definitely an eco-feminist kind of reflex in Annette Messager's work. Similarly in Carolee Schneeman's work, so she's a very famous performance artist, also very, very feminist. And some of her work, I think, crosses over into eco-feminist territory. So she has a long-running work that she did from 1981 to 1987 called Infinity Kisses, and it came out of the fact that every morning her cat would come to the bed and start kissing her on the face, kissing her on the nose, and sometimes on the mouth, right? And it's interesting how the mouth somehow feels a little bit taboo when it comes to non-human affection. Whereas, like, if your cat licks your cheek or your hand or your forehead, it doesn't feel as taboo. But like lip to lip, mouth to mouth, it feels a little bit taboo. So this work is not without its kind of transgression between human and non-human. And so every morning she documented this. She would take, these would be, I guess, selfies now, quick pictures of her and her cat giving her kisses for the run. I think it was for just, like the life of the cat for those 7 years. I don't think the cat only lived 7 years, but I think she started documenting the cat when the cat was already an adult. So there's a way in which this shows a domestic scene of human-non-human bonding, of human and non-human caring for each other, but there are all sorts of other things that we could talk about. One of which would be to understand that when you have a pet, and for those of you who have pets, like a dog or a cat, I have a cat. He's sleeping behind me right now. Hopefully he doesn't wake up to disturb this lecture like he did for the lecture yesterday in my other class. I forgive him. When you have a pet or a cat, one of the many things that happens to you, and we're talking at the physiological level, and we're only coming to find this out, is that our gut microbiome is affected by our cats. Like, there's actually like a feedback loop between their bacteria, their viruses and gut microbiome and our own. And in fact, one study I read preparing for this class, they've done studies of little babies. It's very, very important for a baby to get good gut flora, to get good bacteria. So one of the many ways this happens, the two crucial ways, is to have a vaginal birth. You get all these good microbiota through vaginal birth rather than like cesarean or other forms of births. And having breast milk from your mother, like actual breast milk. The breast milk gives all these incredibly good bacteria to then populate your microbiome. It turns out when young babies, young children have pets, the pets give them even more good bacteria, so that their microbiota are even more diverse, and by extension, their immune systems are more healthy. And we're coming to find all sorts of incredible things about the gut microbiome. Our moods, even like the way we think. There's something known as the gut-brain axis. Like the health of our microbiome conditions the health of our cognition, of our brain. And it's connected to the other microbiomes of the body. So we think this is like a tangential, weird little work, but in fact it gets to a central notion of what it means to live with other species and how they actually bring well-being even on a physiological, psychological level. So there are all sorts of incredible things about this work that we could talk about. It seems like a very simple work, but it's quite rich. Oh, and every time I talk about the gut microbiome and keeping it healthy, I always say this. The thing scientists are finding is that the best thing for the beasties in our stomach, the things that they eat and thrive on, and in fact that's how they make serotonin. 90% of our serotonin is made in our guts. Starch, fiber. Carbohydrates, fiber. That's what they like. And you'll find those things in plant-based foods. So I always say that when I talk about the gut microbiome. Another example, when we've talked about this before, so I'm not going to spend too much time on Maya Schmecker, but remember her canine typology. So this installation she did with dogs, and she synthesized her serotonin with the serotonin of her dogs, and you as a viewer could go in and breathe it in the installation space that she did. So this is where the serotonin was synthesized. This is this little lair that she built. Well, it's not so little. You'd crawl into it and you can smell the serotonin. So this too taps into the ways in which pets actually condition us physiologically. They affect us through olfactory, through our gut. Olfactory means smell, through our guts. And that we live in a multi-species, interspecies world. So this is a very eco-feminist idea. And she did another work which was really controversial, and it'll be very obvious why from the get-go, because most of the time when I show this to students, they recoil. There's something very taboo about cross-species breastfeeding. So for this work called Hybrid Family, she took certain hormones that would allow her to lactate. Humans, just like any other mammal, they only lactate when they're pregnant, right? When they're pregnant, when they give birth, and after they've given birth, right? So she took certain hormones. Incidentally, she says this is very important. Men can also do this. Men could also take these hormones and breastfeed and be nurturing, which is a very interesting thought. But she takes these hormones and then she breastfeeds her puppy in the gallery. So this was a performance. So this taps into some very strong taboos. This was very controversial. This was in Austria. There were a lot of right-wing groups that said this was against family values. What's interesting, well, first I will say that there is something, for me, it does feel somehow inherently taboo. It feels strange to see a human woman breastfeed a puppy, and I imagine many of you feel the same way, and most of the public would. What's interesting, of course, is that there's a whole industry based on cross-species milk consumption, right? There's a whole industry. It's called the dairy industry. People are drinking or eating the products that come from the mammary glands of other animals all the time, mainly dairy cows, but also goats and so on and so forth, right? So there's a weird way, once you place it in that context, the fact that cross-species milk consumption is happening all the time, and in adults, which may not actually be the healthiest thing. Like, once we're weaned from our mother's breast milk, from like like most other species on the planet, like the last thing you want to do probably is to keep drinking that milk, which really is supposed to make you go from a small infant to, to set you on your way to grow. Most species, if not all species on the planet, stop once they've been weaned. But there's something about humans that, I don't remember how many years ago now, 10,000 years ago, we started thinking it would be a good idea to keep on going with milk, and not from our mother, but from other species, right? So we get down a fascinating set of ideas here about milk, nurturing, and cross species. And there's an argument to be made that ethically, if we're just talking strictly about ethics here, that there may not be anything unethical about this situation, about this scenario. She is willingly consenting to breastfeeding this dog, and the dog is simply getting nutrients, right? This puppy is simply eating and getting nutrients. So inherently, while it might feel like it's a cultural taboo, from an ethical perspective, there may actually be nothing wrong with it whatsoever. Weirdly enough, the milk drinking practice that isn't taboo, that's culturally embedded, so milkshakes, ice cream, so on and so forth, that stuff that is like second nature to everybody, that actually may be unethical. Actually, it's almost 100% unethical, because of course calves have to be taken away from mothers, so that humans can take the milk and use it for production, right? And for their own consumption. So there we have a problematic ethical relationship in the dairy industry, but you don't really have it in this work. So it's quite wild. It's quite wild. So again, another work that sends us off into all sorts of charged, complicated, interesting ideas. But definitely one that's ecofeminist in the sense that she's caring for, she's nurturing. This is definitely a form of, one would say, radical nurturing and radical care. So if you want to write about this work in your response, if you want to mention it somehow in your response, do so, because this is one work where I've had just amazing discussions with students as we sort of pick apart the taboo and the ideas that are inherent to this work. Whether you like it or not, I'm definitely interested in what you have to say. Artists that are ecofeminist in this way, where they show sort of this dependency, or this sort of feedback or connection between a non-human other. So you're definitely seeing it here. You'll also have examples of works where it won't be with animals, but it'll be with nature itself or with plants, right? So I could have given a lot of examples, but it would have been way too much. But someone like Caitlin Berrigan, who's made a work called Lifecycle of a Common Weed. This is a dandelion. And incidentally, dandelions are very yummy to eat. I don't know if you've ever eaten a dandelion. Where I come from in France, we would go out and pick dandelion and then make salad with it. Dandelion is not just the weed. It's very, very good. Be careful probably going out and picking it in New York, because who knows like what's in the ground, what sort of stuff the plant has taken up. But if you see dandelion at the market, definitely try it. It's bitter, so you have to dress it in a certain way to offset the bitterness, but it's yummy and it's incredibly good for you. Dandelion is known to be very good for you, especially good for liver health. So what's interesting about this work is that Caitlin Berrigan has a liver disease. And she takes a certain medicine that's derived from dandelion, because dandelion is good for liver diseases. And so what she does here in this work, she gives back. This is interesting. It's like it's a cycle of giving back and of caring, right? So not appropriating nature unidirectionally, not saying, I'm going to take this dandelion, I'm going to use it for my own well-being. It's this wonderful, small, but poetic and kind of beautiful gesture where she has an installation where she gives back to the dandelion what's been given to her. So she actually takes out blood, her own blood, and gives it to the dandelion. And we know this. Dandelions, along with beets, along with all sorts of plant life, feeds on nitrates. And blood is nitrate rich, right? So what she gets the gift that she gets from the dandelion to make her more healthy, she then gives back to a dandelion plant. So this is definitely a work about caring, about nurturing, and about the non-mastery of nature. So in that sense, it's very ecofeminist. Another work that is along these lines, but I think this is getting us more towards the idea of vulnerability, of dependency, of human and non-humans being inherently vulnerable together. So this is Miro Kim. It's called The Pig That Therefore I Am. She's riffing on the title of a book by Jacques Derrida, The Animal That Therefore I Am. It's a very important book. So she took this is a performance that's documented photographically, where she went to a pork producing place, a pig farm, and she got completely naked, and she put herself among the bodies of the pigs. And maybe at first you couldn't tell, but this is her right here. So this is a human body, a human female body. So this is ecofeminist in the sense that it's showing the shared vulnerability between non-human body, in this case porcine, pig, and the human body, in this case female. And there are other images too. So she's in there with the pig. So showing this shared precarity, and also sort of breaking down this binary between human and non-human. Of course, there are differences between the human animals and non-human animals like pigs, but once you see an installation like this, you start to think, wait, there are also some similarities. There's skin, there's bone, there are nerve endings, there's gravity that bears down on the body. There's the idea of resting. There's the idea of being connected to a group of fellow creatures in a room that in a place that's actually seems pretty stifling. So this performance gesture is very ecofeminist in the ways we've been describing. And I also wanted to bring in, we could have done a whole class if we had more time on the relationship between animals and disability rights or disability activism. But I thought I would put an example of this in our ecofeminist lecture, because there are some key similarities between disability theorists, those who work on the discrimination of people that are differently abled, and ecofeminism. And one of the best is Sonora Taylor, who has a disease called I always mispronounce it, but arthrogryposis. You'll probably be able to pronounce it better than I do. But it's a certain disease that she was born with, where her joints, her bones aren't fused correctly. Well, I put correctly in quotes, right? Because we don't want to be normative. But she's born abled in a different way. And she walks differently, and she needs help. Like, she needs assistance to get around in life. And so one of the points she makes is, she says that everyone assumes that people who are differently abled need assistance, and the people who are normatively abled are they're autonomous, they're on their own. But that's wrong. There are all sorts of ways in which everybody, no matter how you've been born, no matter what sort of ways your body has formed, that you're completely dependent on other people, on institutions, on other species, on nature, on the city you live in. There are all sorts of ways in which we're all dependent. So disability scholars like Sonora Taylor will break down the binary between, autonomous, able-bodied people and then differently abled people who need all sorts of help, right? It just doesn't make sense. We're all dependent. We're all interdependent. And then the way in which her work ties into what we're talking about today, she makes paintings, but she's also a brilliant writer. And you can YouTube her. She has a number of nice speeches on YouTube. She's an eloquent speaker. She makes a connection between her disease and the bodies of animals who, bred in domestication, also have this. Some of them also have this very disease, And she also makes the broader point that the way in which disabled people or differently abled people are oppressed or discriminated against, there are ways in which they're compatible or linked oppressions with the way in which animals are deemed to be in some ways inferior or disabled or differently abled, right? She has a nice story in her book. I highly recommend it. This is just of all the books I could recommend to you. This is on the top of the list, called Beast of Burden. So this is a collection of essays of hers where she talks about the connections between animal rights, animal welfare, animal advocacy, and disability theory. So she has a reading of animal and disability liberation as going together. She talks about how when she was younger and the way she looked, the way she moved, she was always animalized. She was always called, in some ways, a monkey or some other sort of use of an animal epithet that was in some ways derogatory. So that was the beginning of her making the connection between the discrimination of species and the discrimination of differently abled people. Another work I really like is Ronnie Horn Bird. It's a book, a collection of photographs of birds that are photographed from behind. And I'll just show you a few. And I feel like I'm going, we still have to talk about Carol Adams, so I'm going to go a little more quickly with Ronnie Horn. But I just love just the idea of vulnerability. Just the simple fact of photographing an animal from behind creates, in me anyways, this sense of vulnerability. Like you immediately want to care for this creature that you're seeing. And what's interesting is that in each case, you think of them as vulnerable, that they can't see you seeing them, but they're quite beautiful. The plumage is totally beautiful. Once you realize that actually these are all dead, they're all taxidermied birds, then it takes on a whole different resonance, which is interesting. And if we were in class, I think we would talk about it a lot more. But now I think we want to get to Carol Adams and the sexual politics of meat. I'm sorry, my heater just kicked on, so if you hear that hissing noise, that's a bit of a pain. You can still hear me just fine, but you know, it is what it is. We're all working from home, so hopefully it'll turn off in a bit, and it's not too distracting. So Carol Adams is a really, really important thinker within this discourse of ecofeminism that we're laying out today. And that's why I didn't give you an excerpt of her most famous work, and this is one of the most important works in ecofeminism altogether, The Sexual Politics of Meat from 1990. It would have been far too long. I could have given you the introduction, but it would be far too long for this class. So I gave you something she's written much more recently, where she talks about basically like the history of this book and the history of her ideas and how people have received it. And it's a very good introduction to her philosophy, to her thinking, to her ecofeminist theories. So please read that and incorporate it somehow in your response this week. But the fundamental gesture that she makes, there are a lot of things that she does in this book, but she argues that, typo. The main argument in the book is that in a patriarchal meat-eating world, animals are feminized and sexualized, and women are animalized. So the idea is that the way in which animals are presented to make them more appetizing, to make them more seductive, weirdly enough for both women and men, it's coded as feminine and it's sexualized. So think of just try. It'll be almost like an endless task. The list just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Think of all the words in which animals and meat are connected to women and sex. Just think of all the animal body parts who double, you can also use to signify female body parts. It's quite incredible, right? Thigh, breast, chick, wing, I guess not so much. All sorts of terms. And I'll show you some examples from her book. And then on the other side of this, then, it's not only that animals are feminized and sexualized, that like, chicken breasts are breasts. Women themselves are also then animalized, reduced to animal parts. So this is a poster from a very famous protest that happened in 1968 during the Miss Belgium, think like Miss America, but for Belgium here. The protesters brought out this sign basically reducing the female body to simply like cuts of meat that you would find in a butcher shop, right? So like rib, fillet, rump steak, so on and so forth, right? So Carol Adams makes one of her central arguments is that there's a connection in patriarchal societies between the reduction of animal bodies into sexualized, feminized, consumable things, and women themselves are then also reduced to consumable, subordinate, sexualized and animalized things. So it's as if in patriarchal societies, both women and animals are consumed in similar ways. And then that consumption is normalized through everyday language and everyday media, right? So there are all sorts of incredible... These are now dated because it's, this book, the most recent issue of this book, I think would have been, like 15 years ago. But just imagine all of the ads and all the ways in which meat and women and sex are brought together. So there's an Arby's, there's clearly the hamburgers, or I don't know if they're hamburgers at Arby's, whatever they're called. They double as breasts. I think this is all stuff. I mean, this is, how disturbing can you get, right? Look at this this chicken. It's like it doubles as a Playboy. Like it looks like it's just bizarre. This chicken is on all fours in a very sexualized position. Even the language that's used for advertising food for animal products, it's usually sort of dripping with sexual, sexist language. I mean, they're just all over the place. It'll blow your mind away. This is Burger King. I can't imagine an ad like this running anymore. It's clearly doubling. It's advertising the sandwich, but doing it through oral sex. I think these are all advertisements that fans of the book ended up sending her. And so in this more recent edition, she just added all these ads, all these clippings that people sent her in the mail. And one of the other things that she does is she shows how the construction of femininity happens through the sexualized, becoming meat and sexualization. But it's not only the impact here is not only on the construction of female identity, it's also at the construction of male identity. So look at this one, real men eat meat, right? This idea that to be masculine, to be manly, you have to eat animals, right? You eat lots of red meat and you have protein, like the protein obsession is quite crazy. And this fear of, there's even a term, I think, soy boy, right? There's like the opposite of the manly man is the one who eats tofu, is the vegan or the vegetarian, and so on and so forth, right? This is actually starting to feel a little bit dated. I mean, I'm sure these are tropes that a lot of people still hold, but maybe it's starting to go away a little bit. I don't know if you've heard of the documentary The Game Changers. I highly recommend watching it. It's all about athletes that have gone to plant-based diets, and there are all sorts of studies, in fact, about how these athletes are not only doing as well, but maybe actually they're doing better in their performance. They're getting stronger, and so on and so forth. So it's interesting that maybe the stigma of the vegan or the vegetarian as less manly for men might start to be breaking down. But I'm sure it's still a very strong cliche in culture. And the tofu, the soy thing is actually really kind of weird. There are all sorts of anxieties about soy having estrogen in it. It's a different type of estrogen. We'd have to go into studies. I'm not going to go into it, but it's a different type of estrogen. But if men are worried about ingesting soy, ingesting estrogen, they would not be drinking anything that comes from mammary glands. They wouldn't be drinking anything that's based out of dairy, right? which is in fact hormone estrogen, right? So, or partly. So these are all just really interesting ways in which culture, advertising, and again, many of you did a really nice job with your visual cultural analysis. It's starting to break down a little bit. It's reinforced in all sorts of ways, but it's starting to break down. There is no mad tofu disease. Anyways, I'm going to stop talking about these adverts because they're just kind of fascinating. So I brought in a more recent one. I remember seeing this. I was at the store, the grocery store one day, and this is a magazine called Cured. I guess it has to do with cured meats. And I think you can right off the bat see how this is. I think this must be a leg of, it could be lamb or pork. This goes back to Carol Adams' idea that once something becomes meat, it becomes a sign without a referent. Like you don't know what it's referring back to. You have no idea what it is, other than the piece of meat that it is, right? So this is some kind of a leg of something, and then of course it's been inserted into a high heel. So here you have a perfect encapsulation of her argument that women and animals are sold together, are consumed together in this sexualized sort of collapse, right? In this way where they're both sort of sexualized. Because, like the idea here, I guess it's geared towards a male consumer who both wants like a woman with a nice pair of legs and wants his prosciutto or his ham or whatever, right? And wants to consume both. So, I mean, this is just in some ways very, very obvious. I also talk about, in class we talk about this a little bit more, but Trump used to sell steaks over the mail, mail order steaks. And this gets to the idea of the male subject position, the sort of the patriarchal figure, the sort of like the androcentric, overbearing male figure. I don't know if you can come up with a better example than Trump, with all due respect. He sort of encapsulates this very old world, old school patriarchal figure. It just makes so much sense that he would put his name on selling meat as this prestigious, this of course would be high-end levels, high-end cuts of meat. It just sort of makes so much sense that they would go together. And you have some artists that have tapped into this aesthetics of meat, the sexualized aesthetics of meat. One of them would be Louise Bourgeois in her Fillette. I write about this in my dissertation too, so I got to be careful. I can't just keep going on and on and on about these works, so I'm going to go quickly. But this is a work, obviously, every time I put this work up in class, all the guys in the class, they start to cringe a little bit, because you can tell exactly what it is. It's a sculpture, but it's really this really oversized large penis. It's a phallus, right? So you have the testicles on the bottom, and then the shaft of the penis pointing upwards, and it's displayed in a number of different ways. But one of the ways it's been displayed, actually, in the original exhibition that it was in, was on a meat hook. This meat hook, and it's hanging from the ceiling in the exhibition space. So here we have a penis that doubles as a slab of meat. So this really visceral critique of this subject position of the domineering, mastering patriarchal male that chases women and eats steaks, right? This is turning that on its head. And what's really interesting is that Carol Adams and a number of other thinkers show that actually since 9/11, there's been an uptick in the eating of meat, in the advertising of it, in this sort of carnist. There's even like a carnivore diet, which is, to me, it's completely insane. That this is actually symptomatic of an anxiety. This is an anxiety of male vulnerability, of males actually not having power, of actually being vulnerable to the world around them, which would make sense coming after 9/11 and terrorism and so on and so forth. That whole history, that whole legacy of the past 20 years. So Bourgeois already in 1968 is turning all this on its head, showing the male phallus, the thing that supposedly is so strong, it's the center of power. It is in psychoanalytic discourse of Freud and in Lacan, in certain more sophisticated ways in Lacan. This thing that's supposed to exude power here has been reduced to a slab of meat. So the one that does the mastering has become the victim in Bourgeois' sculpture. And here she is from a very famous photograph of Robert Mapplethorpe, where she's holding the Lafayette almost like a baby, which has all sorts of resonance with the history of Freudian psychoanalysis, because Freud thought that women, they had a problem with the fact that they didn't have a penis as a sexual organ. And so, long story short, Freud assumed or made the argument, had the theory that women have penis envy, like they wish they had a penis. And so the way in which they fulfill this envy, the way in which they fill this purported lack that they have, is by making a child. So the baby becomes the surrogate penis. This is what Freud thought 80, 90 years, no, 100 years ago now. So she's almost mocking this by holding this big phallus, this big oversized penis. She's holding it. In other images, it's like very clearly she's cradling it as if it's a child, as if it's a baby. But of course, she's just smiling. So she seems to be making fun of this theory. And her last work, because I don't want to go on too long, and I also want to stress the point that I think I would consider myself an ecofeminist. And biologically, I'm male. So just like being a feminist, you don't necessarily have to identify as a female to be feminist or ecofeminist, right? So Zhuan Huan is a Chinese artist who did a performance in New York in 2002 at the Whitney. This is the old Whitney. It's now part of the Met, right? The Met Breuer. It's a performance he did where he. In really absurd parodic terms, he made a meat suit, so he looked like this bodybuilder strongman, all made out of meat. So you might be able to make connections with Lady Gaga and her meat dress, I think, which is a little later. And she was herself influenced by something, and I can't remember what that was, something much older. But here he is in this meat suit. He can't really walk very well. Which is kind of funny. So he's made himself to look really strong, like he's filled with muscle, and he literally does have muscle, of course, also fat, but like muscle from, I'm assuming, cows on his body. And he's walking down the street, but he can barely move. So it's a really interesting performance, and I think we can. There are a number of ways to read it, but I think we can also refer back to this idea of male anxiety. This overcompensation of being virile, of being strong, of being muscular, of being obsessed with animal protein, as a secret symptom of actually being vulnerable, or of an overcompensation for actually never feeling sort of manly enough, quote unquote, especially in the aftermath of 9/11. Because, of course, this is right in 2002. So this work also taps into some of the ideas of Carol Adams. So as you're doing that's it for a lecture. So as you're doing the response for the Carol Adams reading, by all means, choose one of these examples if you'd like, if it helps you to talk about the work. It could be really interesting. It could be really interesting for you to weave in those ideas. And come up with an interesting response. Okay, everybody, I'll talk to you next week.